She saved the millionaire contract of the foreign billionaire in another language, and he was in shock. Before the story begins, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from, and at the end, do not forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story, everyone. The night in Boston was cold, the kind of cold that bites the skin and makes any sensible person run inside. But Emily Walker was not just any sensible person. She was the most dedicated hostess at Harbor Breeze, the most charming and most exposed restaurant on the Boston waterfront. And at that exact moment, she was at the top of an aluminum ladder, balancing with a screwdriver in her hand, trying to adjust the lighted billboard that announced the week's special menu. The ocean wind pushed her brown hair in every direction. The ladder shook. The screw refused to cooperate. "One more second," she murmured, narrowing her eyes as she pressed the tool. "There. Nothing will ruin my night." That was when the universe decided to prove her wrong. The sound came before the water, a deep, low roar, the kind of noise that makes the stomach twist. Emily turned her head toward the ocean and saw the wall of water rising in the dark, lit only by the restaurant lights. Her eyes widened. No, boom! The wave crashed against the pier with the force of an explosion. Cold, salty, merciless water flew through the air in a bright, chaotic curtain. Emily did not even have time to scream. The water hit her straight on, soaking her from head to toe, knocking the screwdriver from her hand and almost tipping the entire ladder over. She held on to the billboard as tightly as she could, coughing, her hair stuck to her face, her uniform heavy with water. And it was exactly in that second, the most embarrassing moment of the night, that the soft sound of an imported engine cut through the air. Emily blinked, trying to clear her eyes, and saw the car. Black, elegant, impeccable. A luxury sedan that looked like it came straight from a magazine, pulling in slowly right next to the pier. The headlights lit her up like a cruel spotlight. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked as if he had been shaped by a tailor personally. Dark gray suit under a black wool coat, brown hair perfectly combed. Upright posture, confident, the kind of presence that makes an entire room fall silent the moment he walks in. Grant Sullivan, Vice President of Innovation at Sullivan Pharma Group. And at that moment, the last person Emily wanted seeing her dripping with seawater in the middle of a pier. He stopped beside the car, looking up. His dark eyes met hers. And then, he tilted his head slightly, as if he were processing the scene in slow motion. Emily felt her face burn under the cold. She wished she could disappear, evaporate, turn into sea foam. But all she managed to do was take a breath, let out a defeated sigh, and murmur, "The tide only rises against me." The sentence came out soft, but the wind carried it to him. Grant blinked, and then, for a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth curved. It was not exactly a smile. It was something between surprise and quiet amusement. Emily climbed down the ladder as fast as she could, her soaked sneakers making ridiculous sounds with every step. She tried to smooth back her wet hair, but gave up halfway. It was useless. She looked like a cat abandoned in the rain. Grant was still standing in the same place, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. "Good evening," she said, forcing a professional smile while water dripped from her nose. "Welcome to Harbor Breeze. Reservation under?" He studied her for another moment, as if he were checking whether she was real. "Sullivan, Grant Sullivan." His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that closed million-dollar deals. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She knew that name. Everyone at the restaurant did. He was the VIP of the night, the client responsible for the biggest booking of the month. The man who could not, under any circumstance, be greeted by a hostess soaked in seawater who smelled like the ocean and despair. "Of course, Mr. Sullivan." She swallowed, trying to hold on to her composure. "Your table is ready. Please follow me." She turned to lead him toward the entrance, but her wet shoe slipped on the wooden deck. Emily stumbled, her arms opening in an involuntary attempt to balance herself. Grant stepped forward instinctively, as if he were going to steady her. But she caught herself at the last second, gripping the railing with force. "I'm fine," she said too quickly, letting out a nervous laugh. "Completely fine. Everything is under control." Grant stepped back, but his expression had changed now. Less formal, more curious. "Are you sure?" he asked, and for the first time, Emily heard something in his voice that was not coldness. It was almost kindness. She nodded quickly, adjusting the wet collar of her uniform. "Absolutely. Accidents happen, especially when the tide decides to have its own opinion." He didn't answer, but Emily had the strange feeling that he was holding back a real smile this time. She started walking toward the door, trying to look confident, but every step was a battle against embarrassment. And then Grant spoke again. "Do you speak French?" Emily stopped, turned slowly, confused. Yes, more or less. Why?" His eyes met hers, and this time there was something urgent there. "Because I need help. Right now." And in that moment, Emily realized the night had just become much more complicated and much more interesting. Emily pushed the restaurant door open with her shoulder because her hands were still shaking from the cold, and she let Grant walk in first. The warm air hit her like a hug, but she knew she was leaving a trail of water across the polished wooden floor. Every step was a small puddle. Every movement, a vivid reminder of the disaster on the pier. "Please wait here," she said, trying to sound professional. "I'll let the manager know you arrived." Grant nodded, but his eyes were already scanning the room, looking for someone. He seemed tense, the kind of tension from having 15 things happening at once and none of them going well. Emily stepped away quickly, but before disappearing into the back, she glanced at the mirror on the wall and almost fainted. Her hair looked like a nest of seaweed. Her mascara had slid down her face in thin lines. The collar of her uniform was crooked, and there was a dark streak of salt water running down her shoulder. "Great, Emily," she murmured to her reflection. "You look like a mermaid who gave up on life." The mirror, as always, did not answer. She took a deep breath and went to the back where the manager, Richard, was checking the reservation list on his tablet. "Richard, the VIP is here," she said, trying not to look like someone who had just been hit by a wave. He looked up and froze. "Emily, what happened to you?" "The tide," she said, as if that explained everything. "Where's the translation team he asked for?" Richard blinked, confused. "Translation? What translation?" Emily's stomach sank. "The team that speaks French. He scheduled it in advance. It's in the reservation." Richard looked at the tablet, slid his fingers across the screen, frowned, and then made a face. "Emily, it doesn't say anything about French here. It only says private meeting, VIP room, 4 people. She felt her stomach twist. "Richard, he just asked me if I speak French. He needs someone right now." "Well," Richard rubbed the back of his neck. "Nobody here speaks it. The chef knows 3 words. I know how to order wine, and you?" Emily opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I learned on my own. I watch videos, I read books, but I'm not professional." Richard looked at her as if she had just said she knew how to fly helicopters. "Emily, if you know anything, it's more than anyone else here. Go offer your help. The man is a billionaire. If he says no, we improvise. But I'm soaked. And he's desperate. Go." Emily wanted to argue. She wanted to say she looked ridiculous, that she wasn't qualified, that this would end in disaster. But the problem was that Richard was already looking at the tablet again, and she knew that deep down, he was right. She took a deep breath, straightened her wet uniform, and returned to the main room. Grant was standing near the window, looking at the ocean. His hands were in his pockets. His posture was straight, but his shoulders were slightly tense. Emily approached slowly, stepping carefully so she wouldn't slip again. "Mr. Sullivan?" He turned. "Did you find someone?" She hesitated, swallowed. "Not exactly, but I speak French. I'm not fluent, but I can manage. If you want, I can try to help." Grant studied her for a long moment. His eyes went down to her soaked uniform, up to her wet hair, and then back to her face. Emily felt her cheeks warm. "I know I don't look reliable right now," she admitted with a crooked, shy smile, "but I promise I'm better with words than with waves." The corner of his mouth curved. It was quick, almost invisible, but it was there. "All right," he said. "I'll go get the documents from the car. Wait here." Emily nodded, and Grant walked out through the main door. As soon as he disappeared, she let out the breath she had been holding. "Okay, Emily, you can do this. It's just French. You read French every day. You understand French." She took a step toward the VIP table, and that was exactly when her wet sneaker met a puddle she had left on the floor herself. Her foot slipped, her arms opened, And Emily, in a moment worthy of physical comedy, slid forward as if she were skating on ice, grabbed the edge of the table to keep herself from falling, but in the process, she knocked over the neatly stacked pile of menus. They flew through the air in slow motion, coated paper sheets sliding across the floor like playing cards in a failed trick. Emily froze, both hands still gripping the table, eyes wide. "You did not see anything," she said to the chair beside her. "None of this happened." The chair, as always, did not answer. She bent down quickly and began picking up the menus, stacking them in any order, trying to ignore the fact that her hands were still shaking. That was when she heard the door open. Grant was back, holding a black leather folder, and, to Emily's complete horror, he was looking directly at her, crouched on the floor, surrounded by menus. She jumped to her feet, holding the messy pile against her chest. "They fell," she explained, "too fast. On their own. The wind, or gravity. Definitely gravity." Grant said nothing, but she was sure she saw the corner of his mouth twitch again. He walked to the table and set the folder on it, opening it with precise movements. Inside were organized documents, marked with colorful sticky notes and handwritten notes. "These are preliminary contracts," he explained, his voice returning to a serious professional tone. "The meeting is with French investors. I need someone to review the main clauses and tell me if there is anything unusual." Emily set the menus aside and stepped closer. Her eyes moved over the first lines of the document. Accord de partenariat stratégique. She knew those words. She had studied contracts as a reading exercise. "Strategic partnership agreement," she murmured, barely noticing she said it aloud. Grant lifted his eyes, surprised. "You understand this?" Emily nodded slowly, her eyes still on the paper. "Yes, this part talks about profit distribution, and this one," she pointed to a clause marked in yellow, "talks about territorial exclusivity." Grant stepped closer, watching her with focus now. It was no longer casual curiosity, it was genuine interest. "Go on," he said. Emily felt her heart speed up, not from fear, but from something else. Something she did not know how to name. She was being taken seriously by a billionaire CEO, while dripping salt water on the floor. "I can read the rest," she said, her voice steadier now, "if you want." Grant watched her for another second. Then he pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. "Sit," he said. "We have half an hour before the meeting." Emily pulled the chair from the other side of the table and sat down, trying to ignore the fact that her uniform was soaking the cushion. And as she began reading the document softly, translating it line by line, Grant Sullivan, the man who closed million-dollar deals without blinking, watched her as if she were the most important piece on the board. And maybe, without either of them noticing yet, she really was. Emily was halfway through the third page of the contract, pronouncing each French word with care, when the restaurant door opened with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the room. She looked up and saw a woman walking in as if she owned the place. Impeccable white suit, stiletto heels clicking on the floor like marching metal, blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, and a designer bag hanging on her arm like a trophy. Grant looked up from the document and sighed, quietly, but Emily heard it. The woman stopped beside the table, looked at Grant, then at Emily, and then back at Grant. "You are joking with me," she said, her voice sharp as glass. Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "Claire, I thought you would arrive later, and miss the chance to see you improvising with." Claire looked Emily up and down, her cold blue eyes taking in the soaked uniform, the wet hair, the hands still trembling slightly. "Local resources?" Emily felt her face heat up. But before she could respond, Grant spoke first. "Emily is helping me with the documents. She speaks French." Claire let out a short laugh. Not a happy one, the kind people make when they think something is ridiculous. "She speaks French," Claire repeated, as if testing the words in her mouth. "How convenient." Emily pressed her fingers against the table, trying to stay composed. She knew this type of person. She had dealt with arrogant customers before, but something about Claire was different. She was not only arrogant, she was calculated. "Convenient is one word," Emily said, forcing a polite smile. "I prefer to say last-minute luck, but it works." Claire turned toward her, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where did you learn French? Sorbonne? McGill?" Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second. "YouTube," she answered, her voice steady. and apps and used books I bought in secondhand stores." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Claire blinked, once, twice, then she smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind a snake would give before it strikes. "How charming," Claire said, pronouncing each syllable as if she were chewing something sour. "Grant, do you really think a self-taught hostess is the best option to review million-dollar contracts?" Emily felt the hit, not in the words, but in the tone, in the way Claire said hostess as if it meant incompetent. She looked at Grant, expecting him to agree, to say Claire was right, that Emily really wasn't qualified. But Grant did none of that. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Claire, his voice low and controlled. "She already found 3 translation errors you missed last week," he said. "So yes, Claire, I do." Claire's face lost color for a second. Then it turned red. Emily held her breath. She didn't know if she wanted to jump with joy or disappear under the table. Claire recovered quickly, adjusting her purse on her shoulder with a sharp movement. "Of course," she said, her voice even colder now. "Forgive my concern for the company's image, but if you're comfortable delegating responsibilities too—" She looked at Emily again. "Unqualified staff, then fine." Emily took a deep breath. She felt the words rising in her throat before she could stop them. "You know, Claire," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I may not have a diploma on the wall, but at least I know the difference between partenariat and parrainage. And apparently, that already puts me ahead of a few people." Grant coughed, but Emily was almost sure he was holding back a laugh. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't laughing. She took a step toward the table, her eyes locked on Emily as if memorizing every detail of her face. "Careful, dear," Claire said, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't know where you're stepping." Emily held her gaze. Her heart was racing, but she kept her posture steady. "Maybe not," she answered. "But so far I'm doing fine." The air in the room grew heavy, dense. Then Claire turned to Grant, ignoring Emily completely. "I need to talk to you. In private." Grant stood, picking up the folder from the table. "5 minutes," he said, then looked at Emily. "Stay here. Don't finish the document without me." Emily nodded, and the two walked toward the hallway leading to the private office. As soon as they disappeared, Emily let out the breath she'd been holding and sank into the chair. "Wow," she whispered to the salt shaker on the table. "I really just talked back to an executive in a white suit." The salt shaker did not respond. "You think I went too far?" she asked, spinning it between her fingers. "Because I feel like I went too far, but I also feel like she deserved it." The salt shaker remained silent, as always. Emily sighed and looked at the document in front of her. The French words seemed blurry now, not because she couldn't read them, but because her head was spinning. She was just a hostess. A girl who learned French on her own because she liked subtitled movies and dreamed of traveling one day. And now she was in the middle of a corporate battle she didn't even know existed. That's when she heard quick footsteps coming down the hallway. Grant appeared first, his face tense. Claire came right behind him, her heels hitting the floor with force. "Let's continue," Grant said, sitting down again. "Claire will follow the review." Emily swallowed hard. Great. Exactly what she needed. A hostile audience. Claire pulled a chair from the other side of the table and sat, crossing her legs with irritating elegance. "Please, go on," she said, her voice so sweet it couldn't be sincere. "I'm eager to see a self-taught worker in action." Emily took a deep breath, ignored the tone, focused on the document. And just as she was about to turn the page, her hand hit the glass of water Grant had ordered earlier. The glass tipped. The water slid across the table in slow motion. Emily tried to catch the glass, but only managed to knock over the pen beside it, which rolled across the table, fell to the floor, and ping, 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 stopped right at Claire's feet. Absolute silence. Claire looked at the pen, then at Emily. "Impressive," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Truly impressive." Emily felt her face burn. She wanted to explain, to say it was an accident, that she wasn't always like this. But the truth was she was always like this. So, instead of apologizing, she took a deep breath and murmured, "The tide is always rising against me." Grant looked at her, and this time he didn't hold back. He smiled, a real smile. Claire, on the other hand, did not smile. She simply picked up the pen from the floor, placed it back on the table a little too firmly, and said, "Let's finish this quickly." And in that moment, Emily knew she had just made herself an enemy, but at least she had made Grant smile. And maybe that was worth something. Emily never imagined she would be walking through the halls of Harbor Breeze wearing a soaked uniform, carrying a leather briefcase that wasn't hers, on her way to a meeting with wealthy French investors. But life had a strange way of turning ordinary Tuesdays into dramatic comedy episodes. Grant walked ahead, his steps steady and sure. Claire followed right behind him, her heels echoing in the hallway like a countdown. And Emily walked last, trying not to look like someone seconds away from a nervous collapse. "Breathe," she whispered to herself. "It's just French. You know French. You love French." The briefcase in her hand didn't answer, but she was convinced it was judging her. They stopped in front of the private meeting room. Grant turned to Emily with a serious expression. "You will translate the main clauses. If they ask direct questions, I'll answer. You only translate. Understood?" Emily nodded, her mouth dry. "Understood." Claire straightened her white blazer and gave Emily a sideways look. "Try not to drop anything," she said quietly, but loud enough for Emily to hear. Emily tightened her grip on the briefcase and forced a smile. "I'll do my best." Grant pushed the door open, and Emily stepped into the private room as if walking into an arena. The room was beautiful. A polished mahogany table, crystal chandeliers, windows overlooking the ocean, and seated around the table, 3 impeccably dressed men and a woman with elegant glasses. Every one of them turned their eyes toward her at the same time. Emily felt the weight of their stares, felt her wet uniform cling to her back, felt insecurity rising in her throat like a wave. But she didn't stop walking, until her foot caught on the edge of the doorframe. Emily stumbled forward, arms spreading to keep her balance, the briefcase nearly slipping from her hands. She recovered at the last second, grabbing the edge of the table with her free hand. Silence. The 4 investors watched her with expressions ranging from surprise to confusion. Emily straightened herself, held the briefcase against her chest, and said the first thing that came to mind. "Bonsoir." And then, because she couldn't stop herself, "La gravité est mon ennemi naturel." Gravity is my natural enemy. The woman with the glasses blinked, and then she smiled. Just a little. But it was there. Grant sat at the head of the table, his face neutral, but Emily could swear she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Claire, on the other hand, looked moments away from a complete meltdown. "This is Emily," Grant said in English, his voice calm. "She will assist us with the document translation." One of the men, the oldest one, with a gray beard and gold-rimmed glasses, leaned forward and asked in French, "Vous êtes traductrice professionnelle?" "Are you a professional translator?" Emily took a breath. She wasn't going to lie. "Not now." "Non, monsieur," she replied, her voice steady. "Mais je parle couramment et je comprends les termes juridiques." "No, sir, but I speak fluently and understand legal terminology." The man exchanged a quick glance with the woman in glasses. Then he nodded. "Très bien. Commençons." "Very well. Let's begin." Emily released the breath she had been holding and pulled out the chair next to Grant. She sat slowly, trying not to make noise, and opened the briefcase. But as she did, the pen resting on top of the documents rolled across the table. In slow motion, straight into the lap of the youngest man, the one with the navy blue tie. He looked at the pen, then at Emily. She gave him a nervous smile. "Pardon." He picked up the pen and returned it to her without a word. But Emily noticed his eyebrow lift slightly. "Great start, Emily," she murmured to the briefcase. "Truly flawless." Grant began speaking, explaining the general terms of the contract. His voice was steady, confident, the kind of voice that commanded a meeting room with no effort. But then he paused and looked at Emily. "Clause 3, paragraph 2, he said. "Translate, please." Emily found the line in the document and read it aloud. "Cette clause stipule que la distribution des bénéfices sera proportionnelle aux investissements initiaux avec un plafond de 15% pour les partenaires externes." She translated to English right after, clear and precise. "This clause states that profit distribution will be proportional to the initial investments with a 15% cap for external partners." The man with the gray beard leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Et si l'investissement dépasse le montant initial prévu?" And if the investment exceeds the initial amount planned? And what if the investment exceeds the initial expected amount? Emily looked at Grant, who nodded, giving her permission to answer. She turned to the man and said, in French, "Dans ce cas, un avenant contractuel sera nécessaire pour ajuster les termes. Cela protège les deux parties." In that case, a contractual addendum will be needed to adjust the terms. This protects both parties. The man nodded, satisfied, and Emily felt something warm expand in her chest. It was not just relief. It was pride. She was doing this, truly doing this. But at that exact moment, Claire decided to speak. "Before we continue," Claire said, her voice sweet but sharp, "I would like to clarify that Emily does not have formal certification in legal translation. I thought it was important to mention." Silence fell over the table like a heavy curtain. Emily felt her face burn. Not from embarrassment, from anger. The woman with the glasses looked at Claire, then at Emily, and asked, in French, "Cela pose-t-il un problème pour vous, mademoiselle? Is this a problem for you, miss?" Emily took a deep breath. She looked at Claire, then at the woman, and she answered, her voice clear and steady, "Non, madame, ce n'est pas un problème. Je suis ici pour aider, pas pour impressionner avec diplôme." "No, ma'am, it is not a problem. I am here to help, not to impress with degrees." The woman smiled. It was not a small smile. It was a smile of genuine approval. "J'aime votre honnêteté." "I like your honesty." Claire pressed her lips together. Grant, on the other hand, turned to her and said, quiet but firm, "Claire, if you interrupt again, you may wait outside." Claire blinked, shocked, but she did not reply. Emily, still processing what had just happened, looked at Grant, and he looked back at her. It was not a professional look. It was something else, something that said, "I trust you." The meeting continued. Emily translated clause after clause, answering questions, clarifying terms, moving through the French with a fluency she did not even know she had. And when the gray-haired man finally closed his folder and said, "Nous sommes satisfaits," continue on demand. "We are satisfied. We will continue tomorrow." Emily felt her legs almost give out from relief. Grant stood, shook everyone's hands, and Emily did the same, trying not to look like someone who was on the edge of an emotional collapse. When the investors left, Claire went after them without looking back, and Emily was left alone with Grant in the empty room. She set the folder on the table and let out a long, unsteady breath. "I thought I had ruined everything," she admitted, her voice low. Grant turned to her, his hands in his pockets. "You were perfect," he said, and then with a half-smile, "except for the pen." Emily laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was a laugh of pure relief. "The tide only rises against me," she murmured. Grant stepped closer. "Maybe," he said, his voice softer now, "but you are swimming well." And at that moment, Emily realized something that frightened and moved her at the same time. She did not want this night to end. Emily could not explain how, but somehow she had survived the first meeting without causing an international disaster, which, considering her history with gravity and liquids, was practically a miracle. Now, 2 hours later, she was back in the private room. But this time, the situation was different. The French investors had asked for an extra session to review the contract attachments, and Grant insisted that Emily keep helping. Claire was there too, of course, sitting on the other side of the table like an ice statue, watching every move Emily made like a hawk. Emily tried not to think about that. She tried to focus on the documents, on the French words that moved across the page, on the questions she had to translate. But it was hard to focus when Grant was sitting close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something discreet, wood-toned, that matched the way he spoke, firm yet gentle. "Next clause," Grant said, turning the page. Emily leaned forward to read better, and that was when her elbow hit the glass of water that was next to the documents. Everything happened in slow motion. The glass tipped. The water spilled across the table like an uncontrolled river. And the white linen cloth, the main cloth, the expensive one, the one that probably cost more than Emily's salary, absorbed every drop like a silent thief. Emily froze. Everyone at the table froze. The gray-haired man looked at the water. The woman with the glasses looked at the cloth. The man with the blue tie looked at Emily. And Claire? Claire looked at Emily as if she had just committed a crime. "Mon Dieu," the woman with the glasses murmured. Emily felt her face heat up. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say it was an accident. She wanted to disappear inside her own bag and never come out again. But all she managed to do was take a deep breath and whisper, The tide only rises against me. Grant turned his head toward her, and Emily saw. She saw the moment he held back a laugh. His shoulders trembled slightly, his lips pressed together, his eyes shone with something between amusement and warmth. But he composed himself quickly and turned to the investors with a calm smile. "Ce n'est rien," he said in French. "It's nothing. Continuons. La clause 7 is plus important. Clause 7 is more important." And then, without giving anyone time to react, Grant pulled the wet tablecloth from the table in one quick, natural motion, as if it were part of the plan, and placed it on the empty chair beside him. The woman with the glasses blinked, surprised. But then she nodded and went back to the document. Emily stayed seated, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Grant had saved her. Again, she looked at him, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. He didn't say anything, but the message was there, clear as water. Relax. It's all right. Emily took a deep breath and focused on the document again. But Claire wasn't ready to let it go. "Maybe," Claire said, her voice sweet but sharp, "it would be better to keep drinks away from the work table, to avoid accidents." Her tone made it clear that accidents was a polite word for incompetence. Emily pressed her fingers against the paper. She felt the words rise in her throat, ready to explode. But before she could answer, Grant spoke. "Claire," he said, his voice low but firm, "we're in the middle of a review. Focus on the contract." Claire opened her mouth, closed it, and then forced a tight smile. "Of course." But Emily saw the look Claire gave her. It wasn't anger. It was worse. It was a look that said, "I'm going to destroy you." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Emily translated each line with extra care, making sure not to touch anything that could fall, break, or explode. When the investors finally stood up and said goodbye, Emily felt her whole body relax. She had survived. Again. But while she was putting the documents back in the folder, she heard Claire approach. "Can I talk to you?" Claire said, her voice low and cold. "Alone?" Emily looked up. Grant was on the other side of the room, talking with the man with the gray beard. He hadn't heard. Emily swallowed and nodded. "Of course." Claire waited until everyone had left the room. Then she closed the door and turned to Emily with a smile that was not friendly at all. "Do you really think you're helping?" Claire asked, crossing her arms. Emily blinked, confused. I'm doing what Mr. Sullivan asked." "What Grant asked," Claire corrected, his name leaving her mouth with calculated familiarity, "was a professional translator, not a hostess who learned French on YouTube." Emily felt the hit. Not in the words themselves, but in the way Claire said them, as if Emily were something disposable. "I understand you don't like me," Emily said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "but I'm here because he needs help, and so far I have helped." Claire took a step closer, her heels clicking on the floor. "You're here because Grant feels guilty," she said, her voice low and poisonous. "You are charity, a distraction, and when he gets tired of playing savior, you'll go back to where you belong, waiting tables." The words hurt, more than Emily expected, because deep down she knew Claire was right. Emily was just a hostess, a girl who learned French on her own because she couldn't afford classes. A girl who worked in a seaside restaurant because it was the best she could get. And Grant? Grant was a billionaire vice president who closed international deals before breakfast. What was she doing here? Claire must have seen the doubt on her face because she smiled. A victorious smile. "Now you understand," Claire said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "Do everyone a favor and leave before you make everything worse." And then she left the room, leaving Emily alone. Emily stayed still for a long moment, looking at the wet tablecloth still on the chair. "She's right, isn't she?" she murmured to the tablecloth. "I'm only getting in the way." The tablecloth, as always, did not answer. Emily sighed and picked up the folder, ready to leave. But when she opened the door, Grant was on the other side, waiting. He looked at her, and something in his face changed. "What did Claire say?" he asked, his voice serious. Emily forced a smile. Nothing important. Grant didn't seem convinced. He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her. "Emily?" She took a deep breath, looked at the floor, at the folder, anywhere except his eyes. "She said I am a distraction," Emily admitted, her voice low, "that I am getting in the way more than helping, and maybe she is right." Grant stayed quiet for a moment, then he took the folder from her hands and set it on the table beside them. "Look at me," he said. Emily raised her eyes, reluctant. "You saved this meeting today," Grant said, his voice steady. "Not Claire, not me. You, the French team trusted you, and I trust you." Emily felt something warm rising in her throat. It was not tears, but close. "But I keep dropping things," she said, trying to laugh, but the laugh came out weak. "I am a walking disaster." Grant smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was a real one. "Maybe," he said, "but you are the smartest disaster I have ever met." And in that moment, Emily realized something frightening. She was not just helping Grant with contracts. She was falling in love with him. Emily did not expect Grant to want dinner at Harbor Breeze. He had just closed the first stage of a $1 million contract. He could have chosen any 5-star restaurant in Boston, any elegant, modern place with expensive wine and a menu in 3 languages. But he did not. He chose to stay there, at the seaside restaurant where she worked, where the tide rose every night, where accidents seemed to follow her like shadows. "It is a way to thank the team," Grant had said, as if it were simple. "And you know the place better than anyone." Emily had wanted to say no. She had wanted to make up an excuse, anything to avoid serving dinner to the man who was slowly becoming her favorite thought of the day. But she did not say no, because deep down, she wanted to be close to him, even if it was dangerous, even if it was confusing. And now, 2 hours later, she was in the main dining room, adjusting the tables while a storm formed over the ocean outside. The sky was dark gray. The wind hit the windows hard. And the tide? The tide was rising too fast. "Great," Emily murmured, looking through the window, because what this night needed was a little meteorological drama. The salt shaker on the table beside her did not answer, but she was sure it was judging her. Richard came through the kitchen door, carrying a tray of empty glasses. "Emily, is the deck secure?" She looked at the outdoor deck, where some tables were set with an ocean view. The waves were already hitting dangerously close to the wooden boards. "Secure is a strong word," she replied. "I would say questionable." Richard sighed. "Bring the chairs inside, just in case." Emily nodded and went to the deck, pushing the glass door against the wind. The cold air hit her like a punch. The smell of salt and storm was everywhere. She started dragging the chairs inside, one by one, trying not to slip on the wet floor. That was when she heard his voice. "Need help?" Emily turned and saw Grant standing at the door, his hands in his pockets, his coat shifting slightly in the wind. She blinked, surprised. "You should not be getting ready for dinner?" He shrugged. "I am already ready, and you are carrying furniture alone in the middle of a storm." Emily looked at the chair in her hands, then at him. "It is part of the job," she said, trying to sound casual. Grant stepped forward and picked up 2 chairs at once, as if they weighed nothing. "Now it is part of my job, too." Emily stood still for a second, processing it. Grant Sullivan, vice president of a billion-dollar company, was carrying restaurant chairs in the middle of a storm. For her. "You do not have to do this," she said, picking up another chair. "I know," he said, walking beside her back inside. "But I want to." They worked in silence for a few minutes, moving the chairs into the dining room. With each trip, the wind got stronger. With each return, the tide rose even more. And with every look they exchanged, Emily felt her heart beat a little faster. When the last chair was inside, Grant closed the deck door and turned to her. "There," he said. No chair was lost to the ocean. Emily laughed, wiping her hands on her uniform. "It is still early. The night is just starting," he smiled. That half smile she was beginning to recognize. The kind of smile that said he found her funny. Not in a condescending way, but in a genuine way. "Emily," he began, his voice lower now. "I wanted to thank you for everything. You went farther than anyone would expect." Emily felt her face warm. "I only translated a few lines." "You did more than that," Grant said, stepping closer. "You saved the meeting, and you did it without any formal training. That is impressive." Emily didn't know what to say, so she did what she always did when she didn't know what to say. She tried to make a joke. "Well, I'm fluent in disasters too. Does that count as a qualification?" Grant laughed. A real laugh. A low, warm sound that made something strange happen in her stomach. "It counts," he said. "It definitely counts." They stood there for a moment, in the middle of the hall, the sound of rain hitting the windows, the ocean roaring outside, and Emily realized with alarming clarity that she didn't want him to step away. But then the front door opened, and Claire walked in, followed by the French investors. The woman with glasses smiled when she saw the decorated hall. The man with the gray beard nodded at Grant. And Claire? Claire looked straight at Emily, her eyes narrowing. "Shall we begin?" Claire asked, her voice sweet but icy. Grant stepped away from Emily, adjusting his jacket. "Of course," he said, slipping back into professional mode. Emily took a deep breath and headed toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the feeling that something important had just been interrupted. Dinner started without problems. The appetizers were served, the wine was opened, conversations flowed in a mix of English and French. And Emily? Emily moved through the room, serving plates, translating when needed, trying to be invisible. But it was hard to be invisible when Grant looked at her every time she passed the table. And it was impossible to be invisible when Claire watched her like a predator. Emily was bringing dessert when it happened. A gust of wind hit the windows so hard that the deck door swung open on its own. The wind rushed into the hall like a living creature. And the rain followed. The guests shouted, standing up quickly as drops of water flooded the space. The woman with glasses shielded her wine glass. The man in the blue tie held onto the documents. Emily set the dessert tray on a side table and ran to the door, fighting the wind to close it, but the latch was stuck. "Come on, come on, come on," she muttered, forcing the metal. "Work with me, please." The door did not cooperate. And that was when a particularly large wave hit the deck, exploding into a curtain of water that flew straight into the hall. Emily took the full hit. Again, she stood there, dripping, hair stuck to her face, her uniform soaked for the second time that night. The investors stared at her, shocked. Grant stood up, holding a napkin as if he were about to run to her. And Claire? Claire had a smile on her face. Not a big one, but it was there. Emily took a deep breath, wiped her face with her hands, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "The tide is only rising against me." The man with the gray beard blinked, and then he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. "C'est hilarant," he said. "It's hilarious." The woman with glasses laughed too, then the man in the blue tie. Even Grant smiled, holding the napkin to his mouth to hide his laugh. The only person who didn't laugh was Claire. Emily finally managed to close the door, locking it firmly. She turned, dripping on the floor, and gave a small nod. "Sorry for the aquatic interruption." Grant stood and walked to her, holding his own jacket. "Here," he said, placing it over her shoulders, "before you catch a cold." The jacket was warm, and it smelled like him. Emily looked at Grant, and for a moment the world around her disappeared. It was just her, and him, and the storm outside. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded. But he didn't step back, and Emily knew in that instant that she wasn't just starting to like him, she already liked him. Deeply, dangerously, and she had no idea what to do about it. Emily wasn't supposed to be in the offices of Sullivan Pharma Group. She was a hostess, an improvised translator, a girl who learned French from YouTube videos and talked to inanimate objects when she got nervous. But Grant had insisted she review the final documents before the official signing. And here she was, sitting in a meeting room overlooking the city, surrounded by stacks of papers worth more money than she would see in her entire life. The room was empty. Grant had gone to get coffee. Claire was somewhere in the building, probably planning the next way to humiliate her. And Emily? Emily was reading Annex B for the third time, and something was wrong. Very wrong. She frowned, flipping back 2 pages and comparing the numbers. "Wait," she murmured, picking up a pen and circling a line. "This doesn't make sense." The paragraph said, in French, "La distribution territoriale sera exclusive à la région de l'Amérique du Nord, excluant le Mexique et les territoires du Pacifique." The territorial distribution will be exclusive to the North American region, excluding Mexico and the Pacific territories. Emily picked up the original document Grant had shown her days earlier. The same paragraph said, "La distribution territoriale sera exclusive à la région de l'Amérique du Nord, incluant le Mexique," including Mexico. Someone had changed incluant to excluant. One word. A single word that completely changed the agreement. Emily felt her stomach turn. This is intentional," she said to the pen in her hand. Someone changed the contract. The pen did not reply, but Emily knew she was right. She grabbed her phone, ready to call Grant, but stopped halfway. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a typing mistake? What if she caused a scene for nothing and ended up looking paranoid? But then she looked at the signature at the bottom of the revised document, reviewed by Claire Eastwood. Emily felt her blood run cold. Claire, of course it was Claire. She needed to tell Grant. Now, Emily stood up too fast, bumping into the desk, and the stack of documents that had been carefully organized slid to the floor like a collapsing house of cards. No, no. She knelt quickly, trying to gather the papers before they spread everywhere. That was exactly when the door opened, and Claire walked in. She stopped at the entrance, looking at Emily crouched on the floor, surrounded by papers, hair falling over her face, pure desperation written all over her expression. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, her voice sharp as glass. Emily stood up fast, holding the documents against her chest. "I was reviewing the contracts, just like Grant asked." Claire stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Her heels echoed on the marble floor. "And do you always do that by dropping everything on the ground?" Emily ignored the comment and took a deep breath. "Claire, I found something." In Appendix B, someone changed one word in the French contract. Incluent became excluent. That changes the entire territorial agreement. Claire's face did not move, not a single muscle, but something in her eyes changed. "You must have read it wrong," Claire said, her voice far too calm. "I did not read it wrong," Emily insisted, extending the document. "It's right here. Someone altered it after the initial approval, and your signature is at the bottom." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Claire crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on Emily. "Do you really believe," Claire said, pronouncing each word slowly, "that you know more about corporate contracts than I do? A self-taught hostess who can hardly carry a tray without dropping it?" The blow hurt, but Emily did not step back. "I know how to read French," she said, her voice steady, "and I know when something is wrong." Claire took a step closer, her expression cold and calculated. "Listen carefully, Emily. You had your moment. It was amusing. Grant felt generous, helping a girl who had no chance. But now you are crossing lines. This contract was reviewed by lawyers, by specialists, by professionals, not by a girl who learned French on the internet." Emily tightened her grip on the paper. "Then explain to me why the word changed." Claire smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they won. "Leave the room," Claire said softly but firmly. "Now." "Not until I talk to Grant," I said. Claire stepped forward and yanked the documents from Emily's hands. "Leave." Emily stood frozen, shocked, her heart racing, anger rising in her throat. "You are hiding something," Emily said, her voice trembling but firm, "and I will tell him." Claire turned, her eyes cold as ice. "Try," she said, "and see what happens when a hostess tries to ruin the career of an executive. See who Grant will believe." Then Claire opened the door and gestured with her hand. "Leave, before I call security." Emily felt tears burn in her eyes. Not sadness, pure frustration. She walked past Claire, head held high, and left the room. But in the hallway, far from Claire's eyes, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. "You will not give up," she whispered to herself. Not now. She needed proof. She needed the original document. She needed something Grant could see with his own eyes. Emily looked around. The hallway was empty. Most employees had already gone home. She knew Grant's office was at the end of the hall, and she knew he kept copies of everything. "This is madness," she said to the wall. "You will get arrested, or worse." The wall did not reply. But Emily was already walking. She reached Grant's office door and turned the handle slowly. "Locked." "Of course it's locked," she murmured. "Why would anything be easy?" But then she remembered. The records room. Grant had mentioned that he kept physical copies of all the contracts there. Emily walked to the end of the hallway and pushed the door to the records room. It opened with a low creak. The room was small, filled with metal shelves and cardboard boxes stacked up to the ceiling. Emily stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and started searching. She opened box after box, going through documents, trying to find the original contract. Come on," she murmured. "Where are you?" That was when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Emily froze. The footsteps stopped in front of the records room. She looked around, desperate, and threw herself behind a pile of boxes stacked in the corner. The door opened, and Claire walked in, talking on the phone. "No, everything is under control," she said, her voice low. "Emily will not be a problem. She has no way to prove anything. Emily held her breath, her heart beating so loudly she was sure Claire would hear it. Claire walked to one of the shelves, took a red folder, and walked out, closing the door behind her. Emily waited. 10 seconds? 20? 30? Then she stood, shaking, and rushed to the shelf where Claire had taken the folder. And there it was, a copy of the original contract, with the word incluent still intact. Emily grabbed the document, folded it, and tucked it inside her jacket. "Now you have proof," she said to the shelf. "Now you can help him." She left the records room, her heart still racing, and went straight to the elevator. But when the doors opened, Grant was inside. He looked at her, surprised. "Emily, what are you still doing here?" She took a deep breath, looked at him, and made the most risky decision of her life. "We need to talk, now." Emily did not expect Grant to listen to her. She was sure he would laugh. Or worse, that he would say she was overreacting. That Claire was trustworthy. That Emily was seeing things that were not there. But he did none of that. Grant looked at the document she placed on his desk, compared it with the revised version, read it line by line, his jaw tight, his eyes growing darker. And then he closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy sigh. "How long have you known about this?" he asked, his voice low. "A few hours," Emily admitted. "I tried to tell you, but Claire," she pushed me out of the room. Grant ran a hand over his face, the tension clear in every movement. "She changed the contract," he said, more to himself than to Emily. "She actually changed the contract." "Grant, this could cost millions," Emily said, taking a step closer. "The French team will notice the moment they read the final version. And when they do, they will cancel everything," Grant finished, "and the blame will fall on me." The silence that followed was heavy. Emily wanted to say something, wanted to comfort him, but she did not know how. Grant stood up, picked up the phone, and dialed a number. "I need you to come to my office. Now?" he said, his voice firm. A pause. "No, Claire, now." He hung up and looked at Emily. "Thank you," he said. "For not giving up, for insisting, for believing that something was wrong." Emily forced a smile, but it came out weak. "That is what self-taught hostesses are for, right?" Grant did not laugh. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her. "Emily, I need you to stay, until the end, as a witness. Can you do that?" She nodded, even though every instinct in her body was telling her to leave before everything collapsed. The door opened, and Claire walked in, her heels clicking on the floor, her expression neutral. "You called me?" she asked, as if nothing were wrong. Grant placed both documents side by side on the desk and pointed to the altered lines. "Explain this." Claire looked at the papers, then at Emily, and then back at Grant. "Explain what?" "Why the contract was changed," Grant said, his voice low but dangerous. "Why incluent became excluent." Claire did not blink. "It must have been a typing mistake. I will correct it immediately." "A typing mistake," Grant repeated, disbelief clear in his voice. "Claire, you reviewed this document personally. Your signature is at the bottom." Claire crossed her arms, her posture now defensive. "Grant, you are taking this too far. It was a mistake." "It happens. Not with you," he said. "You do not make mistakes like this." The silence that followed was sharp. Claire looked at Emily, her eyes filled with cold anger. "It was her, wasn't it?" Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. "She put this idea in your head." "She saved the company," Grant corrected, firm. "Something you should have done." Claire stepped back, her face red. "You are choosing to believe her instead of me? A hostess? Instead of someone who has worked by your side for years?" "I'm choosing to believe the evidence," Grant said, picking up the documents. "And you're dismissed. Immediately." Claire's face lost all its color. "You can't do that." "I can. And I am." Claire opened her mouth, closed it, then gave Emily one last poisonous look before leaving, slamming the door. Emily let out the breath she had been holding. That was intense. Grant sat down in the chair, running his hands through his hair. "Thank you, Emily. Really. You saved everything." But Emily didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, exhausted, and completely out of place. "I think," she began, her voice uncertain, "I think my work here is done." Grant lifted his eyes, surprised. "What do you mean?" Emily took a deep breath. "Grant, I don't belong in this world. I'm a hostess who learned French on my own. I spilled water during important meetings. I almost ruined everything several times. And now that Claire's gone, you don't need me anymore." "Emily?" I think it's better if I go back to what I do best, she continued, forcing a smile. Serving tables, talking to salt shakers, getting hit by waves. Grant stood and walked around the table. You're not listening to what I'm saying. I need you. The company needs you. No, Emily said, her voice firmer now. You need someone qualified, someone who knows what they're doing. I just got lucky. Lucky? Grant repeated, amazed. Emily, you identified a fraud that lawyers didn't see. That's not luck. That's talent. Emily shook her head and stepped back toward the door. I need to go. And before Grant could say anything else, she left. Emily didn't go back to the restaurant. She went straight to the pier, the same pier where everything had started, where the wave had soaked her, where Grant had seen her for the first time. The wind was strong, the ocean restless. The tide rising again. She sat on the edge of the pier, her legs hanging over the water, and looked at the horizon. You did the right thing, she said to the ocean. You don't belong in that world. The ocean didn't answer, but the wind did. A strong gust hit her from the side, blowing her hair in every direction, making her look like a messy sea creature. Emily laughed. Not a happy laugh, a laugh of pure exhaustion. Of course, she murmured, not even one dramatic moment alone. That was when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. You followed me, she said, her voice low. Grant stopped beside her, his hands in his pockets, looking at the ocean. You left without letting me finish. There was nothing to finish, Emily said, still looking forward. You have a company to save. I have tables to serve. It's that simple. Grant sat next to her, his suit probably getting covered in salt and dust. Why are you doing this? He asked. Emily finally looked at him. Because I can't stay, she said, her voice trembling. I can't stay near you, Grant. Not when I feel what I feel. The wind blew again, but this time Emily didn't notice. Grant looked at her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't name. And what do you feel? Emily took a deep breath, looked at the ocean, and then finally admitted it out loud. That the tide is rising, and I don't know if I can swim this time. Grant stayed silent for a long moment. Maybe you don't have to swim alone, he said softly. Emily felt her heart tighten. Grant, you have a company, contract, responsibilities. I'm just me. And what if I say you're the most important part of all this? Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Then I would say you're confused, that you're tired, that you're in love, Grant finished. The world stopped. The wind stopped. Even the ocean seemed to stop. Emily blinked, trying to process the words. You, what? Grant turned fully toward her, taking her hand in his. I'm in love with you, Emily. Since the moment you fell from that wet staircase and said the tide only rose against you, since the moment you translated contracts better than lawyers, since the moment you stood by me even when no one believed in you. Emily felt tears running down her face. But I'm a disaster. You're my disaster, Grant said, smiling, and I don't want anyone else. Emily laughed through her tears. You really know how to win a girl over. Grant leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. Stay, he whispered. Please. Emily closed her eyes. Maybe my tide will change someday. It already changed, Grant said. You just haven't noticed yet. And there, on the pier, with the wind messing up everything and the ocean roaring, Emily finally let the tide carry her. To him, Grant Sullivan was not the kind of man who made mistakes. He closed million-dollar deals without hesitation. He made decisions in seconds that other people would take weeks to process. He trusted his instincts, his team, and his ability to read people. But that morning, sitting in the empty office at 6 a.m., he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had let Emily walk away. Grant rubbed his face, exhausted. He had not slept. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face on the pier. The sadness in her eyes. The words she had said before walking away. Maybe my tide will change one day. He had tried to hold on to her. He had told her he was in love. But Emily had shaken her head, given him a sad smile, and whispered, You have a company to save, and I have to learn not to drown. And then she was gone. And Grant had stayed on the pier like a fool, watching the one thing that truly mattered disappear into the night. Now surrounded by documents and contracts, he tried to focus on work, tried to convince himself he had made the right choice, that letting her go was best for her. But the truth? The truth was that he was afraid. afraid to admit that a self-taught hostess meant more to him than any billion-dollar deal. Grant picked up the French contract for the 10th time that morning and tried to read the distribution clause. La distribution territoriale sera exclusive, he began, pronouncing each word carefully. And then he stopped, because he had no idea what came next. Excluant? Incluant? He murmured, staring at the document as if the words would rearrange themselves. Why does French have to be so French? He picked up the phone and dialed Emily's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and went to voicemail. Hi, this is Emily. Leave your message. If it is about Tide, I already know. It always rises against me. Grant closed his eyes when he heard her voice. Emily, he said after the beep. I need you. Not only for the contract, I need you. Please call me. He hung up and set the phone on the desk, feeling the weight of loneliness for the first time in years. That was when the office door opened. Claire walked in, holding a leather folder, her expression perfectly controlled. Good morning, Grant, she said, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not been dismissed yesterday, as if she had not altered documents and tried to sabotage everything. Grant stood, his jaw tight. You should not be here. Claire smiled, not a kind smile, a calculated one. I spoke with the board last night, she said, walking to the desk and placing the folder on it, and they agreed my dismissal was premature. Grant felt his stomach drop. What did you do? I simply clarified a few facts, Claire said, adjusting her white blazer. Like the fact that you are making emotional decisions based on the opinion of a hostess with no qualifications, that you dismissed your top executive because of a girl who spills water in important meetings. You altered contracts, Grant said, his voice low but dangerous. You committed fraud. I made a typing error, Claire corrected, her voice sweet, which was fixed before causing any real damage. But you put the company at risk when you trusted someone who was completely unfit. Grant walked around the desk, his eyes locked on hers. Get out of my office. Claire did not move. The board wants a meeting, today, to discuss your recent judgment, and Emily, there is nothing to discuss. No? Claire tilted her head. Because they are worried, Grant. Worried that you are compromised, emotionally, and they want assurances that the French contract will not be affected by your distractions. Grant felt the anger rise in his throat. The only distraction here is you. Claire smiled again. That cold smile he was beginning to hate. Then prove it. In the meeting, show them you can close this contract without the help of a girl who can barely tell a contract from a menu. And then she left. Leaving the folder on the desk, Grant opened it. Inside were emails, messages exchanged between board members, all questioning his decision to trust Emily, all suggesting Claire should return. Grant shut the folder hard and grabbed his phone again. He called the one number that mattered. And this time, Emily answered. Hello? Her voice sounded tired. Emily, Grant said, relief rushing through him. Thank God. I need you. Now. There was a long pause on the other end. Grant, I cannot. Please, he insisted. Claire is trying to manipulate the board. She's saying you're incompetent, that I made bad decisions because of you, and I need to prove she's wrong. And how are you going to do that? Emily asked, her voice low. By bringing the hostess back for another round of humiliation. No, Grant said steady. By bringing back the woman who saved the company, the smartest woman I know, the woman I love. Silence. Then Emily let out a long breath. You really don't know when to give up, do you? Grant smiled for the first time that morning. I learned from the best. 2 hours later, Emily was back at Sullivan Pharma's office. She had traded her restaurant uniform for a simple white blouse and black pants. Her hair was pulled into a ponytail, and she carried a folder, the same folder Grant had given her at the very beginning. Grant met her in the lobby, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. You came, he said. I came, Emily replied. But if I knock something over during the meeting, it's your fault. Grant laughed, and then, without thinking, he pulled her into a hug. Emily tensed for a second, but then she relaxed, her arms wrapping around him. Let's finish this, she murmured against his chest. Together, Grant agreed. They went up to the top-floor meeting room. The board was already there, 6 people sitting around a huge table, perfectly dressed, all looking at Emily as if she were some kind of experiment. Claire sat at the far end, the same smile on her face. Grant pulled out a chair for Emily and sat beside her. The chairman, a gray-haired man named Richard Hale, leaned forward. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, "we're here to discuss the recent irregularities in your executive decisions." "There are no irregularities," Grant replied, his voice firm. "There is only a sabotage attempt orchestrated by Miss Eastwood." Claire straightened, her face red. "That is ridiculous." "Is it?" Grant placed the two contracts side by side on the table. "Then explain this. Explain why you changed incluant to excluant in the territorial annex." Silence fell across the room. Richard picked up the documents and read them, his brow furrowing. "Is this true, Claire?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a smile. "It was a typing mistake. A convenient mistake," Emily said, her voice clear. "One that would have cost the company millions and given an advantage to your personal contacts in Mexico." Claire turned to Emily, her eyes furious. "You have no proof of that." Emily opened the folder and pulled out a series of printed emails. "I do. Emails exchanged between you and Mexican executives, discussing exclusive distribution terms, dated before the contract change." Grant looked at Emily, surprised. "How did you get that?" Emily shrugged. "I have friends in the file room." Richard read the emails, his expression growing more serious by the second. "Miss Eastwood," he said, his voice cold, "you are dismissed. Permanently." Claire stood, her face white with anger. "You will regret this." "No," Grant said, standing as well. "We'll regret trusting you." Claire looked at Emily one last time, her eyes full of pure hatred. Then she walked out. For good. Emily shouldn't have returned to the pier, but it was the only place where she could think. The only place where the sound of the ocean was louder than the noise in her own mind. She sat on the same edge as always, her legs dangling above the water, and looked at the sky. It was getting dark. Heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon. The wind was picking up. A storm was coming. "Of course it is," she murmured to the ocean, "because my life wouldn't be complete without a bit of dramatic weather." The ocean didn't answer, but the wind did, tossing her hair in every direction. Emily had helped Grant in the meeting. She had exposed Claire. She had proved she wasn't just an incompetent hostess. But the moment the meeting ended, she had left, without saying goodbye, without looking back. Because she knew. She knew that if she stayed one more minute near Grant Sullivan, she wouldn't be able to walk away, and Emily needed to walk away. She didn't belong in that world. "You did the right thing," she said to the water. "You saved his company. Now let him move on." The water didn't agree or disagree. It just kept hitting the pillars of the pier. Emily pulled her phone from her pocket and looked at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from Grant. She turned the phone off and put it away. "He'll get over it," she said to her own hands. "You're just a phase, a chapter, a temporary distraction." But the words sounded false even to her. That was when she heard footsteps running behind her. Emily turned, expecting to see a night runner or a lost tourist. But no, it was Grant, and he was running as if his life depended on it. His suit was out of place, his tie crooked, his hair, always perfectly styled, was a mess, and he was out of breath, hands on his knees, trying to recover. He took a deep breath. "You run too fast," Emily blinked, shocked. "Grant? What are you doing here?" He straightened up, still trying to catch his breath. "Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life." Emily stood up, arms crossed. "I'm not making a mistake. I'm leaving. Like I should have from the beginning," Grant said, taking a step closer. "You cannot leave. Not now." "Grant, it's over," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I helped. Claire is gone. The contract is safe. You don't need me anymore." "I will always need you," Grant said, his voice firm. That was when the wind picked up. Suddenly, violently, the sky opened, and the rain began to fall. It wasn't gentle rain. It was a full storm, heavy, cold drops that soaked everything in seconds. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the water running down her face. "Of course," she said, laughing without humor. "The tide literally rose against me again." Grant wiped his face, his shirt already clinging to him. "Emily, please, listen to me." "There is nothing to listen to," she shouted over the sound of the rain. "You have a company, contracts, responsibilities. I am just a hostess who knows French. You are the only person who made me feel something real in years." Grant shouted back, taking another step toward her. Emily stopped, her heart beating fast, tears mixing with the rain. "Grant, I fell in love with you," he continued, his voice rough. "I fell in love with the way you talk to objects, with the way you laugh at your own disasters, with the way you never give up, even when everyone doubts you. But I am a disaster, Emily said, her voice breaking. I dropped things. I slipped. I was soaked by waves. I am not elegant. I am not refined. I am not. You are you, Grant interrupted. And you are perfect. And then, as if the universe wanted to make a point, a particularly large wave crashed against the pier. Water shot into the air and hit Grant directly. He stood there completely soaked, his suit ruined, water dripping from his nose. Emily looked at him, and then she laughed. Not a small laugh, a full, genuine laugh that made her stomach hurt. You, she managed to say between laughs, just took a wave to the face in the middle of a declaration. Grant wiped his face again, but now he was smiling. The tide rises against me too, apparently. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, still laughing, tears returning, but this time not from sadness. Grant stepped closer, now inches away from her. Emily Walker, he said, his voice low but steady. You can drop as many glasses as you want. You can slip on as many wet floors as you want. You can be soaked by waves every day of your life. I don't mind, because you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Emily looked at him, her heart beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. What if I ruin everything? She whispered. What if I'm not enough? Grant took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears mixed with rain. You are already more than enough. You always were. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. I am afraid, she admitted. I am too, Grant said. But I'm more afraid of losing you. The wind blew strong, the rain kept falling, the waves kept crashing. But at that moment, none of it mattered. Emily opened her eyes and looked at Grant. Truly looked. She saw the man who had run after her in the storm, the man who had been hit by a wave in the middle of a love confession, the man who looked at her as if she were the most important thing in the world. The tide is rising, she said softly. Then we will swim together, Grant replied. And Emily finally let go. Let go of the fear, the insecurity, the feeling of not being enough. She leaned forward, closing the space between them, and she kissed him. It was a wet, messy kiss in the middle of a storm. It wasn't cinematic, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was real. When they pulled away, both were breathless, soaked, and smiling like fools. You realize, Emily said, laughing, that we are going to catch a terrible cold, right? Grant laughed, pulling her closer. It's worth it. They began walking back to the restaurant, still under the rain, their hands intertwined. And that was when Emily stepped in a puddle and slipped. Grant caught her before she fell, but in the process, he slipped too. The two of them ended up sitting on the wet ground, laughing like children. The tide really only rises against us, Grant said, still laughing. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. At least now we are sinking together. And in that moment, soaked, dirty, and completely ridiculous, Emily realized something. The tide had turned. Finally, Emily had not gone home that night. After the kiss on the pier, after the storm, after finally admitting she was in love with a billionaire CEO, she and Grant had gone straight to his office. Not for romantic reasons, but because the final meeting with the French investors was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and neither of them could afford to arrive unprepared. So there she was, at 8:45 in the morning, sitting in the Sullivan Pharma meeting room, wearing a blouse borrowed from Grant's assistant, because hers was still wet from the storm, drinking her 4th coffee of the day, trying not to look like someone who had not slept. Grant was beside her, reviewing the documents one last time. He had not slept either, but somehow he still managed to look impeccable. As always. Are you ready? He asked, looking at her. Emily picked up the pen on the table and spun it between her fingers. Ready is a strong word, she replied, but I am awake. That is something. Grant smiled and took her hand under the table. You are going to do great. Emily wanted to believe him. But the truth was that she was nervous. Not because of the meeting. She knew she could do it. She had done it before. But because Claire was still in the building. After the meeting with the board yesterday, Claire should have been escorted out. But apparently, she had convinced someone that she deserved one last chance to explain herself. And that someone had allowed her to join the final meeting, which meant Emily would have to face her. Again. The door opened, and the French investors walked in, the gray-haired man, the woman with glasses, the man with the blue tie. all smiling politely, greeting Grant with firm handshakes. And then Claire walked in. She looked impeccable, as always. Gray suit this time, hair pulled back into a perfect bun, impeccable makeup. And that smile, that awful smile that said, "I am not finished with you yet." Emily tightened her fingers around the pen. "Breathe," Grant murmured softly, "just for her." "You are stronger than she is," Emily nodded, but she was not so sure. The meeting began. Grant opened with a speech about partnership, innovation, mutual commitment. He spoke with confidence, with clarity, with that presence that commanded rooms without effort. And then he turned to Emily. "And now, Emily will review the final terms of the contract," in French. All eyes turned to her. Emily took a deep breath, opened the folder, and began to read. Clause 1. La distribution territoriale sera exclusive à la région de l'Amérique du Nord, incluant le Mexique et les territoires adjacents. Her voice was steady, clear, confident. The investors nodded, following along in their own documents. Emily continued, translating clause by clause, explaining terms when necessary, answering questions with precision. And then she reached the clause Claire had altered. Emily paused, looked at Claire, and then read aloud. Clause 7. Les bénéfices seront distribués proportionnellement avec un plafond de 15% pour les partenaires externes. Cette clause a été modifiée sans autorisation préalable. This clause was modified without prior authorization. Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Claire straightened in her chair, her face turning red. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp. "I never." "You changed incluent to excluent," Emily continued, her voice calm but firm, "and that would have excluded Mexico from the territorial agreement, something that would benefit your personal contacts in competing companies." The woman with the glasses frowned and turned to Claire. "C'est vrai? Is that true?" Claire opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It was a typing error," she insisted, but her voice was trembling now. "A simple mistake that—" "It was not a mistake," Emily interrupted. And then she pulled out the emails she had found the day before. "These are emails exchanged between you and Mexican executives, dated a week before the change, discussing exclusivity terms." The gray-haired man took the emails and read them, his expression growing more serious. Claire stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Are you choosing to believe her?" she shouted, pointing at Emily. "A hostess who learned French on YouTube instead of me? Someone who dedicated years to this company? Someone who committed fraud," Grant said, his voice low but dangerous. "Someone who put the company at risk out of personal greed." Claire turned to him, her eyes full of anger. "You're doing this because of her?" Claire practically spat the words. "Because you're in love with a girl who is worth nothing?" The air in the room froze. Emily felt the hit, not in the words, but in the way Claire said them, as if Emily were trash. But before she could answer, Grant stood up. "Be careful with what you say," he said, his voice controlled but dangerous. "Because the girl you're insulting saved this company, and you almost destroyed it." Claire stepped back, her face pale. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice shaking. "All of you will regret this." And then she grabbed her bag and left, slamming the door. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Emily looked at the investors, expecting to see disapproval, judgment, doubt, but instead, the man with the gray beard began to clap, slowly, deliberately. "Impressional," he said, smiling. "Impressive." The woman with the glasses laughed and nodded. "Vous avez du courage, mademoiselle." "You have courage, miss." Emily blinked, surprised. "I thank you?" The man with the blue tie leaned forward. "Nous avons confiance en vous et dans ce partenariat." "We trust you. And this partnership." Grant looked at Emily, pride clear in his eyes. "So," he said, picking up the pen, "are we ready to sign?" The man with the gray beard nodded. "Absolument." And as the pens moved across the paper, formalizing the agreement, Emily felt something warm spread in her chest. She had done it, truly done it. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel like a disaster. She felt like a winner. After the investors left, Emily was alone in the meeting room with Grant. She was standing by the window, looking at the city below, trying to process everything that had just happened. "Are you all right?" Grant asked, walking closer. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "I think so. It's just that I never thought I could do something like this. Something important." Grant held her face in his hands. "You were always important. You just didn't see it." Emily laughed, wiping her eyes. "I still can't believe Claire called me useless in front of everyone." "She was wrong," Grant said firmly, "about everything." Emily rested her forehead against his. "You really believe in me, don't you?" "Always," Grant said. "Since the moment you fell from that wet staircase." Emily laughed. "That's the story you're going to tell everyone, isn't it?" "Absolutely," Grant said, smiling. "And I'll tell it proudly." Emily kissed him, slowly, deeply, and when they pulled apart, she whispered, "The tide turned." Grant smiled. Yes, it finally turned. 3 months later, Emily Walker was standing in front of the Harbor Breeze restroom mirror, trying to convince herself she wasn't going to faint. "Breathe," she told her reflection. "It's just a ceremony, with international investors, and the press, and the man you love giving a speech about you. Nothing big." The mirror, as always, did not answer. But she swore it was judging. The official contract signing ceremony was happening at the restaurant where everything had started. Grant had insisted. He wanted it to be there, in the place where the tide had literally risen against her, in the place where they had met. And Emily? Emily had agreed, even knowing it meant being in the center of attention, even knowing everyone would be looking at her. She adjusted the navy blue dress Grant had insisted on buying for her. Simple, elegant, but not exaggerated, exactly her style. "You can do this," she murmured. "You already faced Claire, you already exposed fraud, you already got soaked by waves in front of CEOs. This is easy." But her hands were shaking. There was a knock on the door. "Emily?" It was Grant's voice. "They're waiting for you." Emily took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out. Grant was on the other side, perfect in a dark gray suit. But when he saw her, something in his face changed. His eyes softened. A small but genuine smile appeared. "You look beautiful," he said. Emily felt her face warm. "You're biased." "I'm in love," he corrected. "It's different." She laughed, and part of her nerves faded. Grant held out his arm. "Ready?" Emily linked her arm with his. "No. But let's go anyway." The main hall of the Harbor Breeze was transformed. Soft lights, white flowers decorating the tables, candles floating in glass vases, and, in the background, the view of the ocean through the windows, the waves gently hitting the pier. It was perfect. All the chairs were taken, French investors in the front row, members of the Sullivan Pharma board right behind them, journalists with cameras, and in the back, the restaurant staff, including Richard, who waved at Emily with a proud smile. Emily felt her stomach twist. "There are so many people," she whispered to Grant. "There are," he agreed, "and they are all here because of you." Emily was about to disagree, but Grant was already guiding her to the front, where a small stage had been set up with a microphone and a table with the official documents. She sat in the front row, her hands tight on her lap, trying not to look like someone on the edge of a nervous collapse. Grant stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you for being here to celebrate an important milestone for Sullivan Pharma Group and our international partners." He spoke about the partnership, about innovation, about commitment to excellence. And then he paused. His eyes met Emily's. "But before we sign the official documents, I would like to talk about the person who made all of this possible." Emily felt her heart speed up. 3 months ago, Grant continued, still looking at her, "I came to this restaurant looking for help. I was desperate, unprepared. And then a wave crashed over the pier and soaked a hostess who was trying to fix an outdoor sign." Soft laughter echoed through the room. Emily covered her face with her hands, laughing despite the embarrassment. "That hostess?" Grant said, his smile growing. "Could have ignored me. She could have said it was not her problem, but instead she helped me. She translated contracts. She uncovered fraud. She saved this company." He paused, his voice turning gentler. "And, in the process, she changed my life." Emily felt tears burn in her eyes. Grant stepped down from the stage and walked to her, holding out his hand. "Come here." Emily shook her head quickly. "Grant, no." "Please," he insisted. She looked around. Everyone was watching, waiting. "The tide is rising against me again," she murmured. But she stood anyway. Grant guided her to the stage, and Emily felt her legs trembling with every step. When they reached the microphone, Grant turned to her and held her hands between his. "Emily Walker," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You came into my life like a storm, literally. More laughter. You knocked things over. You slipped. You were soaked by waves countless times, but through all of it, you never gave up. You never let anyone make you feel smaller than you are, and you taught me something important. He paused, his eyes bright. You taught me that the tide only rises against those who are strong enough to swim against it. Emily felt the tears falling now. And the tide turned, Grant said, his voice breaking slightly. When you came into my life. The room erupted in applause. But Emily barely heard it, because Grant was lowering himself, taking something from his pocket, a small blue velvet box. Her heart stopped. "Grant," she whispered. "What are you doing?" He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring with a small diamond shining under the lights. "Emily Walker," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion. "Will you marry me?" Emily covered her mouth with her hands, tears falling freely now. "You are proposing to me in front of 200 people?" "I am," Grant said, smiling, "because I want the whole world to know that I love you." Emily looked at him, at the ring, at the people around them, all smiling, waiting, and then she did what she always did when she was nervous. She leaned forward to answer, and her elbow hit the microphone stand, which fell, in slow motion, and crashed to the floor with a loud bang. The entire room froze. Emily stood still, eyes wide, her face burning. "The tide," she began, "always rises against you," Grant finished, laughing. And then Emily began to laugh too, a real laugh, loud, the kind that makes your stomach hurt. "Yes," she said, still laughing through tears. "Yes, I will marry you, even though I am a walking disaster." "Especially because you are a walking disaster," Grant corrected. And then he pulled her into a kiss. The room erupted in applause again, louder this time. Some whistles, some cheers. When they pulled apart, Grant slipped the ring onto her finger, and Emily looked at it as if it were the most beautiful thing in the world. "We are going to have to replace that microphone," she said, still laughing. "Worth it," Grant replied. Later that night, after the contracts were signed, after the investors left, after the press took all the photos, Emily and Grant went back to the pier. The same pier where everything had started. The tide was high, the waves gentle, the sky clear and full of stars. Emily sat on the edge, her legs swinging over the water, and Grant sat beside her. "So," she said, looking at the ring on her finger, "we're engaged." "We are," Grant confirmed. "How do you feel?" Emily thought for a moment, thought about everything that had happened, the waves, the disasters, the humiliations, the victories. "I feel lucky," she said finally. "Lucky I stumbled into you, literally." Grant laughed and pulled her closer. "I'm the lucky one." They stayed there in silence, listening to the ocean, and then, as if the universe wanted the last word, a small wave hit the dock and splashed water on both of them. Emily blinked, wiping her face. "You're kidding me." Grant laughed, wiping his own face. "The tide will never stop rising against you, will it?" Emily looked at the ocean, then at Grant. And then, she smiled. "No," she said, "but now I have someone to swim with." And there, on the pier, soaked and laughing, Emily Walker realized something. The tide had turned, at last, and she would never sink alone again. 6 months later, Emily Walker, now Emily Sullivan, stood at the altar wearing a simple white dress, holding Grant's hands. The wedding was at Harbor Breeze, of course, overlooking the ocean, with the tide rising, and when the pastor asked if she accepted Grant as her husband, Emily looked at him, smiled, and said, "I do. Even knowing the tide will always rise against me." Grant laughed. "And I accept swimming by your side, forever." And when they kissed, a wave hit the pier, but this time no one got wet, because the tide had finally learned to move in their favor. So, what did you think of Emily and Grant's journey? From the soaked hostess who talked to salt shakers, to the woman who saved a billion-dollar company and won the heart of a CEO in the process. Leave your opinion in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to get more emotional stories like this, full of romance, humor, and twists that will make you laugh and feel every moment. See you in the next one.